Thank you for that intro, Enos. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm McKenzie Marshall, and today we're going to be talking about my experience in productionalizing NLP solutions at Barings, and a little more broadly, why NLP is a very important space in the asset management industry. So, we've heard a lot of presentations today about kind of cautionary tales that machine learning is not always the answer. And you're going to need a well-founded case before you really start building out a POC and dedicating a bunch of resources to that. And I think we've all seen the kind of tragic logic flow that starts with, well, I want to use AI because AI is the future. And really, I just know that it's going to somehow, in some fuzzy manner, evolve into enhanced productivity and profit. Of course, this sort of trend of developing entire research projects or sometimes teams on the shifting sands of hype has an incredibly high mortality rate. And luckily, that's not the presentation that we're going to be going through here, or I'm afraid it would be pretty brief. So let's kind of backtrack and deduce why NLP might be an important space for research in asset management. At Barings specifically, Barings is a practitioner of what is known as active asset management. And this is the idea that if you give me, if you allow me to invest your money, I'm going to stay on top of the news, I'm going to keep in touch with any economic changes, read a metric ton of regulatory documents, and respond in an efficient and reactive way to those changes in a way that, at the end of the year, is maximizing your returns. And so, in a more colloquial sense in the business world, this is known as generating alpha, where alpha represents some kind of inherent truth that the market has not yet internalized, and acting on that truth, respectively, before the market internalizes it. Now, the mechanism by which we generate alpha is the investment research process. All asset management firms consume a huge variety of media types, ranging from quantitative to qualitative information. The markets tend to be a little less liquid, so ultimately it emphasizes the importance of the ingestion of documents that we just learned about in terms of how you're going to generate some insight or a thesis on a given asset or that asset's issuing company. So ultimately, our investment research process really scales into how are we going to consume text in a way that is analytically sound and do so at scale. Our research analysts spend huge portions of their day with printed out papers, stacks like this big, and in earnings seasons particularly, when those regulatory documents are very prevalent, they struggle to internalize all of that because it's an operational bottleneck from a human analytical process point of view. And so it's a pretty small jump there to say, okay, well maybe there's something in the NLP space that can help us operate at scale in a more efficient manner. So we hit the first major takeaway that I had in my relationship with our internal business clients. Given that there's a prevalence of hype in our space, everybody is very eager for when the robots will read the papers, and they can just not have to read the papers. And that's a pretty dangerous situation to be in on our end, because that's not really the solution we're proposing implementing here. Every piece of sort of research that we've done has been geared specifically towards augmenting that existing investment research process, not automating any piece of it. And when I say automate, I do mean like entirely automate, like no human interaction. It goes from this to this. Instead, we're looking for solutions that we can put side by side with the analysts while they're doing their normal process to help them ingest information at scale. So in terms of our experience actually productionalizing spaCy, we really dissected the main steps as to how we could help our analysts consume text at scale into 3 sort of subtasks that were sequential. First, given that you have all of these documents just sort of piped in through various subscriptions the firm holds and regulatory pipelines and whatnot, we do have to identify what company those documents are for. Those pipelines are not structured in a way that does that a lot of the time, especially for journalistic content. Then we have to rectify what company that is to an internal ID. This is going to consolidate the different aliases that those companies can go by. And our third aspiration was to sort of provide some sort of additive ranking metric by which our analysts could sort documents for a given company by some sort of relevance metric, which we decided to start with a sentiment score. So we've all seen asks pretty similar to step one. It's a pretty traditional NER problem, and I'd say in practice, it's probably one of the most common ones we will ever see. Two, this is the pairing of the sort of the curation of that output model with rules-based algorithms utilizing a variety of tiers of fuzzy matching topics to ensure that the quality of what goes downstream is fairly high. And three, this was an effort to sort of create an ensemble of classification models to derive a sort of aggregated sentiment score on the content. So the first thing we looked at, of course, was the available pre-trained models, and I will caution that this is sort of beginning 2018, so perhaps things have changed. But what we saw is in our sort of standard large model, there was a tag that was suitable for tagging organizations at scale. And so that model would, for instance, tag the SEC in the first sentence there. Now, the SEC is not actually something that our end users are going to be very interested in organizing and centralizing news about. You would want news from the SEC with context of a company it was impacting directly. So that content wasn't relevant to us, and it became apparent that really what we would want to do is train a new label from scratch, so as to avoid back-training all of the sort of learned behaviors of an existing label for no real apparent reason. So we decided that we were going to train a new label, we call it company, to selectively identify things that were actually relevant to our end users. And second sentence there, we see that a lot of the financial journalistic content utilized tickers kind of in lieu of the company's full name. And so from the beginning, we were aware that we would have to do some focus counter-training endeavors to ensure that we weren't just going to blanket label any acronym that appeared, because the incidents in which they were relevant for us is a pretty huge minority. So given that, I'm going to just step through some of the nuances that we were able to sort of breed into our NER model with, again, really focused training and utilizing Prodigy so that we could iterate things at scale. So the first iteration, we're collecting all of these, all of this content, organizing it by an identity that an entity that we've identified as a company. And I know that the media content tends to center more heavily around certain tech companies than others, but the level of disparity in frequency of articles between companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter to anything else was hugely alarming. And so we started looking into some of the things that we were tagging with those companies. And when a corporate entity's platform product is also the name of the corporate entity, you get a lot of things that are, if you squint, true, but not really practically useful. And so if you see on the top left there, we have Google and Facebook are liable to be treated as utilities. This is in reference to the corporate entity itself. This is what we would consider a relevant usage of those company names to identify. And to the right of that, we see he took to Twitter to deny his involvement in the latest scandal. This is not a corporate entity use of Twitter, and it was largely drowning out the news that was actually relevant to our end users. So we Took probably close to 3 days, wasn't that much time, and with maybe 15%, so probably 10% of the full corpus at that point. We took maybe 1,500 annotations and really focused on occurrences of these types of companies in the text we'd gotten historically. And we were able to really train that kind of selectivity into the model with, kind of remarkable ease if you think about it. This is in part because the syntactic use of these types of platforms in a way that isn't corporate is actually pretty limited. You read a Facebook post, or you do something to Instagram, or whatever, follow me on. And so really narrowing out the false positives there was easy enough to do with just sort of route annotation efforts. The second option, as we pointed to at the last slide a little bit, was we had to selectively identify tickers and not acronyms or abbreviations of other things at large. And another nuance of the end users that were relevant to these efforts is they're not really interested in following particular tickers of benchmark indices like the NASDAQ. Or, we have NDA in this sentence. This is an acronym for a type of document. The FDA is a US governmental organization. These things aren't relevant to them. And so because this issue was wider spread, I definitely say it was more sensitive than the above case, but largely speaking, because all of the majority of those false positive occurrences were captured in the training corpus, we did pretty okay with ignoring things that we didn't want to be identifying. And the third is probably one of the more abstract ones. So we see here, Apple's sales this quarter have been flagging as iPhone releases become derivative. That is in reference to Apple as a corporate entity. We would want to tag that to the right, or you can invest in an Apple iPhone to access these features in the App Store. If you squint, you can make an argument for this sort of content being included. But the problem with including it was, again, it was drowning out a lot of the really relevant financial documents. And also, it's the use of that company name as a modifier of a product. And products were hard enough for us to ignore if we hadn't seen them. So I'd say that the success in really implementing this was most noticeable with companies where we had a lot of examples. So if we had in the training corpus, like a Toyota Camry or a Nintendo Switch or Apple iPhone, we were pretty decent at ignoring the occurrence of those company names when they were used as a modifier of a product. But if we did find something new that hadn't been seen before, it was pretty much a coin toss. So given that we were able to really pull in all of these behaviors into our product, we really recognized the importance of very careful, focused annotation management. It's reasonable, but you can kind of see how people would say this is grunt work and we should offload this, or we should just go buy it from somebody. But at least in our case, and I feel all cases that are done in industry, the more specialized your training is to replicate the exact sort of thought process of your end users, the higher the value of the product, the more business value you can deliver. So to do all of this work, but then sort of offload the main part of the specialization that the end users, you could have knowledge of the end users to save some time, it seemed really like an odd intuition. When we annotated things, we had a very small group. Mostly it was myself and my boss. We were incredibly coordinated. All of the kind of weird events in which we'd be kind of a toss-up on whether or not to tag something, given the context of its inclusion, were all documented, like a literal PowerPoint presentation. And those things were strictly adhered to. And those people really need to be integrated into the main goal of the product you're trying to deliver and the solution that you're trying to really put out there. If they don't really understand what the end use of this is, they don't understand the end users by default, and they're not going to behave as carefully or as they would if they were totally integrated. So again, we do have step 2 in our 3-step ask from above. We did integrate sort of more standard algorithmic solutions on each of the outputs that came out of our NLP model to rectify that entity against a list of tens of thousands of firms that were relevant to Barings. And so this was how we were able to rectify different aliases of things, for instance, like its ticker, its abbreviated name, its full name, to the same ID, and really derive insights about what this content is truly about, and really only tag the content with the focused companies instead of just any mention of any company in that text. I can't imagine a situation in which some degree of algorithmic cleaning of data, either before input into an NLP model or curation of the output of that model, is not going to be helpful in prod. And prod is for pragmatists. Highly advise that if you can have those logical boundaries set up, even if it's not quite as aesthetically appealing as a pure NLP pipeline, it will work better and for way less cost. And really, aesthetics are not worth that much. And to sort of do a quick bit on sentiment analysis. So it's got a lot of hype behind it. We definitely were cautious on the onset and became more cautious as we did work onto this. But our first sort of discovery, right, is that positive and negative are not mutually exclusive labels. If something is not positive, it could be neutral. It doesn't necessarily have to be bad. And the occurrence of these neutral texts from a sentence-wide perspective is hugely pervasive across documents. That is to say, if you were to just aggregate the output scores of 2 classifier models to identify if something is positive or negative, do that across a document, everything is going to crash to whatever kind of narrow neutral zone you define. So we had to introduce some kind of weird algorithmic sort of gut feel boundaries and define sort of polarity conventions, which I borrowed from chemistry. But in this context, think of a non-polar sentence as something that's neutral, and polar as emotionally charged, either positive or negative, or sentimentally charged. So when we were able to identify a certain threshold of polar sentences existed throughout the entire document, we would take the aggregate sentiment score across just those polar sentences and get an idea as to whether or not something was positive or negative. This did help. The huge majority of our content still was in that neutral zone, which was not really useful to the end user. And given the sort of strictness and the effectiveness of our convention standards for the NER ask a couple slides ago, this was much harder to standardize because we had content that came to us across a bunch of different domains, and we parsed it down sentence by sentence. And sentiment is something that travels in the text a lot more than is this entity, this thing. So we had some challenges there in terms of setting up conventions. There were complications with the user not really understanding what a sentiment score was, so we strongly advise abstracting that away into just buckets of this is good, this is bad, this is neutral, to avoid sort of understandings like, this document is 55% positive, which was always super awkward to hear in demos. I'd be like, so maybe don't do that. Secondly, we have journalistic voices are not really easy to compare, and it's not really valid to compare them. If somebody has a sort of widespread editorial piece and they use more evocative language than, for instance, a regulatory document, that doesn't mean it's more or less positive. And so our core assumption on this was challenged, and we knew that going forward we'd have to pair that metric with some identification about the source and the type of source it came from. And sort of a last challenge, some things are always negative and positive. I did a good job ensuring, eventually, that anything that came up in prod that had the word murder in it was labeled negatively, and that was not the case for the first couple of rounds. But things that are financial in nature, they tend to be kind of ambiguous. Like maybe the success of this company to the reader is not good. Maybe that's bad news, and we had that brought up to us. So there were a lot of challenges. I know that was really broad, but I'd like to thank you for your time. Of course, if you want to ask any questions or reach out, really eager to talk about it with you. So McKenzie Marshall at Barings.com. Thank you.